thank you so much for giving up your evening to participate in what for sure is a really important conversation with respect to supporting transgender, gender diverse kids and youth. So I think we'll start with a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to actually throw it over to Tammy to start with her introduction, and then I will introduce myself. And then what we're going to do tonight is really I'm going to walk through kind of some, I'm not sure where everybody is with respect to their knowledge. So we've kind of taken our, gender diversity 101 training material and kind of condensed it down to do a bit of a just 101 basics at the start. But really what we want to spend the most of the time doing tonight is just sharing kind of our perspectives. We called this a trans and parent perspective for a reason. So I will let Tammy introduce herself, and I will introduce myself, and you'll understand why we called it what we did.
Hello, my name is Tammy Plunkett. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the mother of 4 children, all of whom identify as queer. My oldest child is gender diverse, gender creative, and pansexual. My second child is bisexual. My third child came out as transgender at the age of 11. Which is 5 years ago now, and my youngest identifies as gay. So I have a whole lot of experience in terms of relating as a parent of a trans kid and a parent of a gender non-conforming young adult now. What else can I tell you? I was a registered nurse as my first career, and then I became an author and a writing coach, and that's what I do in my day job now, and advocate for the LGBTQ community at large. I am on the Airdrie Pride board, and monthly get to play with Kiersten. It's been 3 years now that Kiersten and I have been co-leading the Parenting with Pride meeting, which is a lot like what we're doing with you tonight. So you will see some playing off of each other, completing each other's sentences, and it's just because we've done it for so long.
Thank you. Thank you, Tammy. So for myself, my name is Kiersten Mohr. My pronouns are she and her. A little bit about me. So start with family first. I've got a 11-year-old and a 13-year-old. I have to think about that for a second. Have lived in Airdrie for about 16 years, I guess. From a day job perspective, so I always say my first career was as a geologist and leadership professional in the energy industry. So I did that for about 20 years. At year 15 was when I navigated my own gender transition. So I identify as trans female. I transitioned both personal life, but also in the corporate life. So obviously learned a great deal going through that. And after transition, got really, really involved in the community. It's when I joined Airdrie Pride, as well as some other organizations, Skipping Stone, I was part of for a few years. And then as well during that time, I actually went back to school and got an undergrad in psychology and have continued on with that and about halfway through my master's in counseling psychology. And then I also started an organization, a consultant organization, which is called Terra Firma Transition Consulting, and it's focused really on using that privilege that I have with respect to corporate experience and leadership to try and get in organizations and at boardroom tables with really the goal of creating more space for transgender, gender diverse folks within the corporate settings or within organizations, really trying to open up that space ahead of when individuals need it. So as Tammy said, both her and I are incredibly passionate for what we do. We've had the absolute pleasure of working with Tammy, with Airdrie Pride, but also our second love, I think for both of us, is our monthly Parenting with Pride meeting. Tammy comes with the parent perspective, and I come certainly with, I always joke that the Ask Me Anything trans person perspective, to try and help parents maneuver and understand what that process might be like for their child. So as I said, what we want to do tonight is that's kind of the frame of the presentation. So we're going to kind of play off each other with respect to the questions that were in the posters. So you're going to get a parent perspective, and then you're also going to get my perspective as a trans person. But like I said, is to start, what we're going to do is just a bit of one-on-one. Before we start, incredibly important, and certainly with the news of the 250 Indigenous youth in BC, I mean this could never be more important than to take a moment and do this land recognition and really have this conversation with respect to acknowledging the past, the injustices of the past, and how that has impacted where we are today. So at Airdrie Pride, we always start everything we do with this land recognition. And really, I think tonight maybe taking a bit of a moment just to really let this soak in and think about those 215 children that have been throughout the news and that were victim to our colonial past. Before we do that, I just want to take a minute and read the land acknowledgement out loud. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piikani, and the Tsuut'ina, the Aaxai and Nakota Nations, Métis Nation, Region 3, and all of the people who make homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. I think one of the most important things to mention with land recognition, or a friend told me this, is we often acknowledge that we live on treaty land, and we acknowledge that past, but we sometimes forget to acknowledge that as colonialists, as settlers, we sometimes don't own up to the fact that we haven't held up our end of those treaties. So that's the other thing to remember when we do land recognition. But with that said, I do want to take just a minute or a few seconds here and just take a bit of a minute to think about and really let this soak in with respect to the news of those 215 children that we've all learned about this week. Thank you. So where I want to start tonight, I like part of my fascination with psychology is really trying to understand with respect to understanding and accepting and creating space for diversity is just really understand for each of us why that can be challenging and I really speak to social identity theory from the perspective of giving ourselves permission to be a little bit uncomfortable with something that's new or different, but really trying to explain why we feel like that and highlight that the reason we feel like that isn't or doesn't really have anything to do with the individual, but rather just our own schema or our own categorization that we've been socialized to understand. So I believe that some of the challenge that comes certainly with trans or gender diversity is this idea of social identity theory. So social identity theory and the way that we do this as human beings is a really positive thing. If we didn't categorize things or didn't learn to categorize things, I always joke that we would need to go to sleep at 9 o'clock a.m. every morning because we'd be so exhausted of having to try and figure out everything that was happening. So what we very naturally do, or how we're socialized, is that we categorize things together. We're taught to put things into categories. And once we do that, we don't have to think about it anymore. So in the context of gender diversity or gender identity and expression, for most of us, I'll be vulnerable, I'm open. I'm 40 years old. So anybody who was probably socialized in that same kind of generation as myself, if you see an individual in a dress, you are going to assume that they're female, and you're probably going to assume that they're heterosexual, and you're probably going to assume that they're attracted to men. That's the category that, be it media, be it parents, be it just society in general has created for us. Once we categorize things, the next thing we do very unconsciously is we identify to an in-group. So we look to others that are like us. And that can be any number of things. That can be faith, that can be identity, that can be, which sports team you like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. And we find comfort and we get empowerment from identifying to an in-group. Everything outside of our in-group we see as out-group. And there's this this dynamic that when we look at our own in-group, we see a ton of diversity. So when we look at everybody we consider in our in-group, we know that people like different TV shows. We know people like different kinds of wine. We know people like different kind of foods, different vacations. But when we look at an outgroup or compare ourselves to an outgroup and do that social comparison piece, we see very little diversity in an outgroup. So I can speak about this personally. Is I think the transition, quote unquote transition, that an individual goes through going through gender transition is very often you move yourself from an in-group to an out-group. So you go from somebody who your circle of friends or family or peers saw you as part of their in-group. They saw that you had your own interests and all those things that make each of us up. As soon as you go through transition, you're all of a sudden in this out-group. And it's hard to see more than the fact that you are just transgender. So I explain this to kind of set the context of the education process, because I really believe that the challenge for acceptance is really recategorizing how we see the elements that make each of us up. So there's many different ways you can explain this. There's the gender unicorn. Excuse me. I often go to the genderbread person. I know AHS has I'm dropping it, Tammy. What was it called? The
Body scan, but something with a body in the word.
Everybody.
Everybody, that's it.
Yeah, everybody. Yeah. So there's a bunch of different versions of this. Essentially all of them are talking about the same thing. So what I want to do is just walk through this a little bit methodically, just to help folks understand. And I want to reinforce with this slide that this doesn't just apply to individuals in the LGBTQ2S+ community, but rather applies to all of us. So every single person has an identity, has a gender identity. So that, to me, is that innate sense of who you are. The way that I think about it or explain it very often is that feeling when you wake up in the morning, that first few seconds before the day starts. That's that feeling and sense of who you are as a person. So identity can occur on a spectrum. So on one end of that spectrum is very, very female or a woman on one side. On the other side of that is male or man, as they use in this example. Or anything in between. So folks or individuals lie anywhere in between those two ends of the spectrum. The next piece is about attraction. So that is who you are attracted to, either sexually or emotionally. And again, that occurs on a spectrum. So on one end, you're attracted to very masculine or male, and at the other end, you're attracted to very female or feminine individuals. And again, anywhere in between individuals can lie. Sex or biological sex is, that is the one that is more known or more socialized for all of us. So what I want to really reinforce with sex is that even biological sex occurs on a spectrum. So what this slide shows is female, male, and intersex. I've done a lot of work on this because it's very commonly what I'm trying to say, the debate, or that's what people will say, there's only two biological genders, there's only two biological sexes. I hear that lots. The reality is that there is actually six biologically defined sexes in the human species. So even sex, which all of us think is very binary, is very much on a spectrum. The challenge is that we don't really understand it because, as many of you know, I'm sure, is that we don't get our children genetically tested every time they're born. They are born and we look at their external genitalia and we make a call on what we think they are based on that, on the parts. And the last piece is all about expression. So expression is really all about how you bring yourself into the world. So we all can understand that. That is, you know, the color of glasses that you put on, that's makeup, that's clothes, that's tattoos, piercings. It's really, again, that sense, all of us, you know, left for work or got ready this morning and we made certain decisions that we were comfortable with respect to how we express ourselves. So that is expression. The most important thing to take from this slide, in my opinion, is that none of these things are correlated. So if we go back to the social identity theory, many of us, I believe, were socialized to build dependencies or correlations between these factors. So if we see male genitalia at birth, then we assume that we say that must mean that that person is a male identity. And if that person is a male identity, then they must have a male expression. And if they have a male expression, then they must be attracted to females, you know, in our very kind of heteronormative society. So the work to do with respect to understanding diversity in this community is to break those dependencies. Any individual, whether in this community or not, is some combination of these four factors. And that is the beauty in it. That is the diversity in all of us, is that none of us are actually exactly the same.
And from a parent's
Sorry.
perspective, from a parent's perspective, the importance that I got from this slide when my child came out as transgender is that I was socialized, like also many of us, to categorize that if my child had female genitalia when he was born and was socialized to be a girl, that when he came to me and said that he was transgender, and I said, how can an 11-year-old be transgender? Because how do you know who you're attracted to yet? And that's because we are so ingrained to associate gender with sexuality. And the LGBTQ2S plus acronym does us no services there because it has mashed up both gender identity and sexual attraction and romantic attraction into the same acronym. So that was very helpful to me to learn this pulling apart of identity and sexual attraction and biological sex and expression. And that's so that this is your best response if anyone ever says to you, how can a 5-year-old be transgender? How can an 8-year-old be non-binary? This is how, because identity has nothing to do with sexual attraction or biological sex or expression.
Yeah, thank you. It's an amazing segue into the next slide. I mean, what we do very often, or do all the time, I guess, in our training is spend some time, what we say, unraveling the acronym. And I'm certainly not going to go through, because you'll be overwhelmed, I believe. I'm not going to go through defining each of these terms. I always say that you can punch any of them in Google and it will give you, without even a click, it'll give you the definition if you're interested. What I really want to talk about with respect to unraveling the acronym is what Tammy was addressing. Is I think the two really big takeaways from this slide is the first one is all about what is the acronym for. One thing that we run into a lot with Airdrie Pride on social media and in other venues as we get that comment or that criticism of, why do you got to keep adding so many letters, and why is it always changing, and why can't you just decide, why can't you just And what I want to say to that is I think that that oftentimes people misinterpret what the acronym is for. Um, so the way that I explain it is really to remember the acronym is not a tool to talk about the community. It's a tool for the community with respect to inclusion. So I'll use myself as an example. The fact that I see a T in that acronym for transgender um, makes me know and trust that I am not the only one. So if we go back to the genderbread person or the gender unicorn, anyone you want to use, the reality is that as we're creating more space for individuals to explore combinations of those factors of what make each of us up, there is going to be new letters, and we should celebrate new letters because that is making somebody feel more included or is a more inclusive thing. Um, as Tammy said, the challenge with the acronym, I always say that the disservice that it does or the confusion that it creates is that it mashes together two things. It mashes together sexuality with identity, which is two completely different things. So if we think about it from, from the human development psychology, that kind of lens, our identities develop at a very young age. So the process of gender identity development happens between the ages of 3 and 8 years old. Sexual identity or sexual orientation is that prepubescent to adolescent stage is when all of us start to figure that out. So I would say, I mean, I think Tammy would agree and she said it, I mean, one of the biggest confusions is that so often identity gets sexualized, and people can't put together or understand why an individual might be struggling with identity before they hit those teen years. So what we've done on this slide for you is just break that acronym apart. So on the left-hand side, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, etc., are sexual orientations. So if we go back to the genderbread person, that's the heart piece. That's who you're attracted to. If we go to the right-hand side, that is identity. That's intersex, transgender, cisgender, non-binary, two-spirit, genderqueer, etc. We have queer written out in the middle of this slide. Queer is for most individuals nowadays is kind of an umbrella term that identifies everybody, or that kind of encompasses everybody or both sides of the spectrum. What we always say with queer is, as many of you may know, queer was a very derogatory thing in its history. It was one of those words that the community took back. So we always kind of recommend that you mirror it. You know, queer works really well for most people, but certainly be cautious using it for individuals who um, may have been attacked with that word. It could be a little bit triggery. So as complicated and as many words and as many identities and as many sexualities as there is in this slide, the reality is that none of them, or that all you have to do is really respect what somebody is identifying as. I always say you don't have to know what all of them are to be kind and respectful. Anything to add there, Tammy? That's kind of the two big takeaways.
Yeah, I think as a parent, I just want to offer the two terms that you will hear most used in the younger crowd nowadays. Kids nowadays tend to use pansexual and non-binary, which are newer terms to us older folks who weren't around, and especially when you had the acronym used to be LGBT or LGBTQ, and P and non-binary weren't in there. So pansexual means that you are attracted to people, not parts. There's a great Schitt's Creek segment that talks about liking the label on liking the wine inside the bottle and not necessarily the label. These are great examples of pansexual. So if your teen or young adult comes to you and says, I'm pansexual, now you know what they mean. Non-binary means that they do not have a gender identity that exists on the binaries, which were man and woman. So it's self-explanatory, but we do hear it a lot. And I just wanted to give it a spotlight for a second.
For sure, yeah. Thank you for that. The going into just the gender terminology, as Tammy said, might be the piece that is a bit more new for folks, just with respect to it's just newer language than gay, lesbian, and some of the other ones around sexuality. So transgender, the ones I like concentrating on are transgender and cisgender to help folks understand what the difference is, because both these terms are, or cisgender is certainly relatively new. So trans and cis, those terms actually come from the chemistry world. They mean on the same side as a molecule would be cis, and on the opposite side of a molecule would be trans. So transgender, thinking back to that genderbread person. So transgender is somebody whose gender identity and or expression is different from the sex that they were assigned at birth. In contrast, cisgender is somebody whose gender identity aligns with how they were identified at birth. So those are the two important takeaways. For me personally, and I think of my family and my spouse, the cisgender this terminology is really important because it gives people terms instead of saying, when people were talking about my spouse and I, they would say things like, well, she's the real, talking about my spouse, she would say she's the real woman, or she's the biological woman, or she's the, and it's very well intentioned. It's not certainly not meant to be negative, but it comes across as mixing up those biological sex and identity. So using myself as an example, my spouse is a cisgendered female. I am a transgender female. As Tammy said, non-binary is an individual who just doesn't identify exclusively one way or the other. So they're, if we think back to the spectrum, they're just in the middle, and use they them pronouns. A little bit more detail, gender expression, as we talked about. This one's fairly intuitive. That's just how we bring ourselves into the world every day. So there's a great number of factors that are incorporated to any one of our gender expression. The other terms that I really like focusing on are the AMAB and AFAB, so assigned male at birth and assigned female at birth. And I do a lot of work in the corporate sector with individuals who have transitioned, and it's obviously important that if somebody's went through transition, you don't communicate that if you don't need to communicate that. But there is certainly going to be, if you've got a child going through it or somebody in your life going through it, the path that I choose is really about giving individuals or giving folks a way to communicate it in an affirming way. So using the terminology assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth is a way to communicate somebody's change, instead of saying they used to be a boy or they used to be a girl. So again, I'll use myself as an example. So if somebody is communicating my change to somebody who doesn't know, the way to communicate it would be, in an affirming way, would be, Kiersten was assigned male at birth. She now identifies as trans female, and she uses the pronouns she and her. What I heard a lot at the beginning, before these terms were present, was she used to be a boy, or she used to be a man. And as we've learned, the reality is that somebody transgendered never identified as a man. Like for me, I never identified as a man. The act of transition was an affirmation of my female identity. It wasn't me switching from one thing to another, if that makes sense. So if we use the language assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth, you are acknowledging the fact that it wasn't that person's choice with respect to the gender they were assigned at birth. So it gives you a bit of a toolkit to use. Okay, now we are going to get into our questions and a little bit more freestyle conversation, which is hopefully way more entertaining for all of you. So the analogy that we really like to use with respect to supporting trans youth, or I use it in the corporate world with respect to adults that are going through it, is the analogy of a bus. And as simple as that sounds, hopefully it makes sense as we go. So what I always say when I'm working with organizations who are helping an individual work through their transition is I always reinforce that that individual is driving the bus. So our job as allies, as supporting that person's journey, is to let them drive the bus. So we are there to fill the bus with gas when it needs, when it runs out of energy. We are there to wash the windshield when maybe things are getting a bit foggy and they're not really sure where to go. We are there to support. But ultimately, the individual, whether it's a youth or an adult or whoever, they are driving. The visualization I use is they're sitting in that driver's seat, and in a bus you've got the door opener right beside them. So they get to control who gets on the bus, i.e., who knows or who they want to bring into their story. And they get to control how fast the bus goes. They get control where they're going with it. They get to control when they stop. We think of the spectrum. They get to control when on that exploration or when in that questioning and when in that exploration they stop and say, okay, now it's time to get off. This is where I need to be. So hopefully that we're going to continue with this analogy through the questions, but just to kind of set a frame for the conversation going forward. Tammy, do you want to
Uh,
add anything?
yes, I do. As a parent, I know it scares the living daylights out of us to have a child drive a bus. But we do have to still let the child drive the bus, and this analogy works equally as well for parents of young children as it does for Kiersten working with an adult in the corporate world. Kids still have to choose who gets to know and how fast social transition happens if there is a medical transition. So these are all equally important for children, and as parents, we just need to see the difference between allowing them to have bodily and life consent versus wanting to eat chocolate cake for breakfast. There is a difference, and you'll see as we go along.
So the first question that we put out there, and really Tammy and I, as I said, have been working together for a lot of years on this, and what we tried to do was we spent some time chatting and tried to come up with the top 5 questions that parents or individuals have asked us, and then what we want to do is just have a back and forth of how we respond or what we think of the question, in the hope that it helps somebody out there, just maybe provides a different perspective. So the first one, and is around, is it a phase? Is this something that everybody at school is doing, so my kid's doing it too? And how can you actually trust your child that they know that something's off or that something's different? So I will let Tammy ask that or answer that first because I need a drink of water.
So I look at it two ways. One is, what if it's a phase? Like I said, I've raised 4 kids. All of my kids have gone through phases, and phases are usually short-lived. So if my child says they would like to use they, them pronouns, then we use they, them pronouns, because what really does it hurt to start using they, them pronouns? And if it is a phase and it's going to pass, affirming them is the safest way to go through the phase. Denying it is not going to be safe to them. And we all know the ending of Romeo and Juliet. If you deny your child something that they want, they'll just push it anyways. So that's what I say about the phase part. The most important thing to know with trans kids, and I heard this a long time ago, and I don't know if it's changed, but is that they are consistent, persistent, and insistent. And I can tell you, when my child came out at 11, I had my doubts, I had fear, I feel like I went through all of the grief stages, because when and I'm sure any parent or caregiver would understand when you have a child put in your arms, if they're in a pink blanket, a blue blanket, or a white blanket, it doesn't matter. You don't look at that child and say, oh, geez, I just hope that one day you're going to have a whole bunch of surgeries and be on medication for the rest of your life. And have a society that looks at you as an outgroup, like Kiersten mentioned earlier. So I was resistant to my child coming out as trans and hoped it was a phase, to be completely honest. But I have learned through my experience with my son that he was insistent, consistent, and persistent. It was not a phase. A year later, it was clear that this was exactly who he was. And when we affirmed him, he was euphoric. And when we did not affirm his identity, he was dysphoric and unhappy and hopeless and miserable. So that was all of the evidence that I needed. And that's how I learned to trust my child.
Um, yeah, I love that. I think from my perspective as a trans adult now, actually it was really good timing because I saw this on social media today. I saw this idea. It was a lesbian woman that posted it, but she said my phase was being heterosexual.
Mm.
And I think of that really, really personally from my own perspective. I always share that I mean, I spent 33 or 34 years hoping it was a phase. I was so challenged with self-acceptance and so challenged to see a life that was meaningful and purposeful after transition. But really it wasn't. I think that we go back to developmental psychology and we look at the reality that our identity develops really, we know this really, really early. And I have a little bit of the cliche kind of trans story, but it was as a kid that I knew something was different. I grew up in the 80s in Saskatchewan, so I didn't know that it was transgender. I knew that it was something different. I was not comfortable. And for me, it was a process of 30 years to figure out what it was. And the reason I do a lot of work that I do now, as far as advocacy community work, is I don't want folks to have to wait 30 years to really affirm who they are. The other way I think of this question with respect to kids is, and I want to validate something Tammy said, is we talk about it a lot in Parenting with Pride, is I shared at the start that I've got an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old. Even as a trans person, it would be challenging. I mean, there's a process as a parent I can't imagine that you have to go through with respect to working through kind of what you thought the future would be versus what it's going to be for your child. And we spend a lot of time in Parenting with Pride having those conversations about creating that space for parents to work through that. I think that with respect to the phase thing, though, I think that when people ask me that with respect to what their kids are going on, I certainly validate that it's challenging to know for sure. Um, but also, there's a little bit of me that thinks, well, what if, even if it is a phase? I mean, what's the harm in just validating your child's identity? And I think about it going back to the genderbread person. If a child's exploring with their gender identity or gender expression, to me, all of that's telling you as a child or at that age is that they're not in the binary endpoints of that spectrum. They're somewhere in between. And I think our job as parents is really to give them the space to explore. I think we all will figure out who we are. And it's just really about not putting boundaries on what that expression or what that identity needs to look like, um, from my perspective.
I think one more point, I don't know if
Sure.
it'll come up in the next slide, but it's on my mind now, so I'll say it now. And that is anyone who spends any time on social media or looking up articles online will fall upon the phenomenon, and that is in heavy quotations, of more trans boys coming out in the teen years than trans girls. And then what and so that is chalked up to a phase. There's a book out there that I won't even mention that is discussing that. And the reality is that the female body's menstruation is scary. And it is a black and white in your face realization that your body is not the body you identify with when you are a trans boy or non-binary. So when a trans male comes out at puberty, it is because puberty is so much more drastic to a trans boy, and it's something they have to face right away. However, for a trans woman, and Kiersten will speak to what being a trans woman is. I only have a trans son. But for trans, from what I've heard, and she'll confirm this, is that trans women, the puberty that the male body goes through is slower and not as drastic as having a period. And then there's this massive world that we live in that is misogynistic and looks down upon anything feminine. If you see an argument between men, they will call each other a female dog, female body parts, and derogatory terms for gay men. Anything that's feminine is looked upon with such disdain in our world that it is a process for a trans woman to leave that masculinity and affirm themselves in the femininity that they truly are. And I'll let you speak to that.
I think all I would add to that is I think in either case, I certainly wouldn't disagree with anything Tammy said. I think in either case, it's trying to, or what I want to do is trying to communicate the feeling of it, and really the reason lots of transgenderist folks come forward at puberty, I agree wholeheartedly with what Tammy said. It's the way that I thought about it, the way that it felt for me was that your body all of a sudden starts working against you. If that makes, it's really hard to explain, but that's the way I think about it. It's like all of these things are happening that all of a sudden don't feel really good, but you have no way to control them. So for me, and I will only speak for me because this could be very different for other individuals. For me, when I started HRT, hormone replacement therapy, what was most impactful to me was actually the blockers. It wasn't adding the estrogen, it was just stopping. As soon as I started blockers, I had this sense of relief. It was like, okay, I've actually got the ability to slow this down, or I've got a fighting chance, or I've got hope. I can't think of any other word other than hope to use. So it is that it's kind of this internal battle. It's like brain versus body is really the way that it felt for me. And the process of transition just put the power back in my brain, if that makes sense. So the next question we get a lot is, is my child okay? Are they okay? And how do you know that? This is, Tammy alluded to it a bit in the last one. I mean, it can kind of be a big bad world for anything that is quote unquote different, or anyone that is quote unquote different. So the next question we put out there is are they okay? So I'll let Tammy again go first on this one.
As I said in my introduction, my first career was as a registered nurse. And when my son came out to me as trans, and I had left nursing for about 10 years when he came out. So my mind went straight back to my only point of reference, because we had heard some bits and pieces of news about the transgender community, but we knew no one who was transgender, and it was very new to me. This was 5 years ago, and even in the last 5 years, the conversation has come up. So when he said transgender, my brain did a backlash to my days studying nursing. And when I studied nursing, being transgender was considered a mental illness. So the first thing I thought was, oh my God, there's something wrong with my child. that, by the way, is transphobic, and I recognize it now as transphobic, and I don't recommend that anybody go that route with their thought process. But my brain did what my brain did, and it's the, you know, the point of reference that I had at the time. So I am here to tell you now in 2021 that transgender is not a mental illness, it is an identity. And so that is something that I had to unpack. The other part of is my child okay? Had a lot to do with society. I was worried because in my mind, I automatically put transgender in an out group, like Kirsten had described at the beginning. And that meant that my child would not get a job, would not find a spouse. And if he did find a spouse, what would the parents of the spouse say? And my mind just went down all of these fear-laden tracks. And so the long and the short of it is that my child is okay. Once he was affirmed and we did hormone blockers, it was like sunshine returned to his life. He did struggle quite a bit with his mental health leading up to his disclosure. And that is also why I immediately thought there was mental health issues and that he needed to see a therapist. He did need to see a therapist because we needed to find the right way to affirm him. And once we affirmed him and changed his name and pronouns and his gender expression was male or masculine, and he presented as male to school, then everything was great. When he truly did bounce right back and become who he is. And then once cross hormones started, so once he started taking testosterone, everything, all of the mental health issues are completely gone. So are they okay is a double-sided coin. There is the, will they be okay in the world? And the answer is yes. And we need to just look at our own biases and our own labeling them as an out group, and instead just make the world a more diverse and wonderful place. And then the other side of the coin is their mental health status and their health status as well. And yes, they're okay there too. Of course, any child who, and I don't want to get into the whole statistics because they're not very clear, but there is very clear indication that non-binary and transgender youth are at higher risk of suicide attempts. And when you measure that against affirmed transgender and non-binary youth who are supported in their identity, the risk of suicide attempts goes down to the normal population. So the key is to affirm our youth and to support them as best as we can, which is even better than we think we can. Just do the absolute best and affirm them every way that you possibly can. And then it's a safety factor. And then, yes, they're okay. We're all okay.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic fantastic summary. When Tammy and I were chatting about this question together, as we got ready for this call, the way that I approached it with Tammy was what would have made me okay, or what would if I could go back, what was the thing that that I would have needed, and really it comes down just to see the path. Like I think that that's the challenge. I think that for both trans youth or non-binary youth, but also parents of trans or non-binary youth, is the reality is that there is not a lot of role models. There's not a lot of people. We don't see it in our community or in our world very often. So it's hard to feel like there isn't going to be opportunity, like there isn't going to be places for our children if indeed they turn out to be transgender. And I think that I was sharing, with respect to my own transition, one of the biggest things my spouse and I were worried about was the impact on our kids and their relationships with friends and those aspects. The reality of it all at the end of the day was the friend circles of my kids. This wasn't even a thing. It was the biggest anticlimactic moment of the whole thing is it was so easy to explain to that generation. So I think it's good to remember that that's the world that they're going into, not the one that we're living in right now. Um, the other piece I really want to add here, and we hear it a lot when children or youth are kind of in that exploration phase, and we miss talking about it on the acronym side, but there is a cue for questioning in that acronym. So what we hear a lot is, is if a child is exploring with their identity and they're also at the same time exploring with their expression, and we'll hear a parent saying, they're identifying as trans male, but they're still wearing red nail polish, as an example. So, um, what I want to do here is just kind of reinforce that is okay. They are okay. They are just in that space of exploring those factors that we talked about with that gender and person. I think that we talk about it a lot with our youth program in that it's okay to spend some time in that questioning period. I spent 20 years there. I got quite comfortable in that, in that space. So it doesn't, that exploration isn't correlated to them being confused or them being not okay or them being stressed out. There is this reality with gender identity or expression or going through transition is that there is absolutely no way to test drive it until you actually put yourself out there in the world and feel how you feel surrounded by others, as your authentic self. So just, yeah, I wanted to say that on this side for sure, because as a parent, it's just giving them room, or as a caregiver, it's giving them space to do that, and really trusting that they will get to where they need to get to. The third question we have is, so this is the point where we assume that you're on the bus. Your child is, your dependent has started the bus and they've hopefully opened the door for you, and you've gotten on the bus with them. So if your child or dependent has come to you and is expressing this discomfort or expressing a need for change, this conversation is really about where do you start and how do you as a caregiver support the transition process?
So there's the feeling way and there's the tactical way of starting. And the feeling way of starting as a parent is truly surrendering to letting your child take the lead. And it starts with a conversation. And it's a conversation that you might hear a whole lot of I don't knows, and that's okay. You just let the I don't knows. It's right back to what Kiersten just finished saying about questioning. But conversations about how can I affirm you? What do you need from me? Do we need to tell anyone, or is this something that you need to explore on your own in your bedroom? Something that I write about that is very important is what we feel as parents is very valid and needs to be processed, but it cannot be done in the presence of our children, and it cannot be done on the backs of our children. So if we are super happy that our child has come out to us as transgender, and we want to plan a gender reveal party and have a cake and a video that we put on social media, and our child is not there, we are burdening them with our joy. And if we are grieving the loss of what we thought was the future for the child we thought we were raising, and we are sad and upset, we can't do that in front of our kids either. So that's where you start. You start by putting on your oxygen mask first and taking care of your emotions, and then being there 100% for your child. And then the tactical things are to use the pronouns that they ask you to use. And if they want you to only use them at home, only use them at home. And if they want you to tell the school and grandma and everybody under the sun, then you do that. And if they want to tell everyone themselves, then you follow that lead. And if they want you to do that emotional labor, you follow that lead, because we're the grown-ups. So yeah, pronouns, name, if the school needs to know, if grandma needs to know, those are generally the places to start. Because Mitchell was only 11, we started with a social transition, and a social transition has a lot to do with that gender expression that we spoke about earlier. A lot about what Mitchell looked like on the outside, and haircuts and gender specific clothes and changing his room, and you don't realize all of the things that you have that are gender specific until you actually have to uh, affirm the right gender for your child. But yeah, that's where we started, was the social transition, name and pronouns, and very deep heart-to-heart conversations, and keeping my emotions in check.
Yeah, that was fantastic. I think that breaking them back, or breaking it into kind of tactical and emotional, I think is a really good way to do it. What I was going to say to that, I think this is a good place to talk about. Tammy and I laughed about this, and I'll let her add some more, because I think that the analogy of the bus works really good, and we talk about this a lot at Parent with Pride. Is the fact that your child is potential, depending on what age they are, they're still a young adolescent or teenager. So if we use the bus analogy, so we've talked about they control who gets on, i.e. who they tell, they control how fast the bus is going, they control where the bus goes and where they stop and when they get off. Um, but as a parent, you still can teach them the rules of the road. We still don't want them to drive the bus into the ditch. We still don't want them to run red lights. And we still don't want them to, to break the rules of the road. So it's differentiating between they still need you to be a parent versus validating or supporting their journey with respect to their gender identity. I thought that was it when Tammy said that when we were chatting before. It was such a beautiful thing.
Mhm.
And the other thing that I love that she said was this idea of processing your own journey. I mean, that's why her and I do Parenting with Pride, is we want to create a space for parents to not be okay with it, to deal with their own emotions, and to work through kind of the change for them. It's a change for your family. What I think is a really beautiful example. I'll use and I love how she said, like, don't try not to do that in front of your kids, but at the same time, I would say your kids know, I would say they have some innate sense that this is a big change for you as well, and that you're going through your own process. And the reason I know that is that when we started, the first thing we started with Airdrie Pride, when we started to build programs, was our youth programs, our community GSA program. And as us as the board, we showed up. It was 30 below out at the end of December, and we didn't expect a single person to come. And when the clock hit 6:30, all of these youth started to come. And in that space, we kind of joked with them. We said, like, we're old. We don't know what you need. Our job is to try and support you, to try and empower your voice in the community. And one of the things they asked for right away was, they said, can you create a group like this for our parents? And I thought it was the most beautiful, most compassionate moment that these group of, I would say 13 to 18-year-olds appreciated that their parents were also going through this change. Um, so I wanted to share that. I love that. And I think that there is lots of resources. Wendy's going to send out resources in different groups other than ours, or as well as ours, that certainly you can access to support yourself and give yourself some grace with respect to maneuvering through this change. The next piece, we talked about this a little bit, but just how do you communicate your family's change? So we've certainly in the 101 part of it given you a bit of language around the assigned female at birth, assigned male at birth, but I'll throw it back to Tammy to kind of communicate, or to chat about kind of the practicalities around communicating your family's change.
So this goes back to your child driving the bus. And when I say child, I mean teen, young adult. My kids are all my kids, even though my oldest is 25. They get to choose if they are stealth or completely out. And stealth means that if they have the expression of a boy and everybody assumes that they're a boy, that they don't go into details about the fact that they're a trans boy or a trans girl, and they just become a girl or a boy. So that's called outing your child, and some children don't want to be outed. They want to only be affirmed as their gender identity and have no reference to their past life and their old name and that kind of thing. And it can be quite, it's like a microaggression to bring up your child's previous pictures and their previous name, because that can be hurtful when it's something that they're trying to leave behind. And it is, when I look back at my son's life before coming out, I can see how hard, and it's making me emotional, how hard he worked to be a good girl. Like he did, and it had to have been so much work for him to put on that show of being a girl when truly inside he was a boy. So I don't want to bring up that time of his life because I know it was difficult for him. And now I look back and I see what he had to go through to perform the identity of a girl that we had put on him when it wasn't who he truly was. So I don't use his name from birth anymore. And I don't, when I do talk about him when he was 2 years old, I still use he, him pronouns. Even though at the time we thought he was a girl and we socialized him as a girl then, now I use he, him pronouns. So these are things that you communicate. Only people who need to know that your child is trans are the people that you tell without having to check with your child. So if I were to bring him into an emergency room right now, I would have to explain that, you know, they might find something below the gown that they weren't expecting. That being said, again, with the child driving the bus, my son, from the second that he came out, has been adamant that he is a trans boy and that everybody is to know that he is a trans boy, and he's an advocate for the community. He speaks. He has been the biggest champion for me to write first my memoir and now the book that I'm working on, Beyond Pronouns, which is the essential guide for parents of trans kids. He's writing the foreword to that book, and he wants the world to know that he's trans because he understands how important that representation is. He needed that representation. That representation is what showed him who he was and got him to fix what was off when we weren't affirming him. So how I communicate about my son is that I'm honest and I say that he is a trans boy because that's what he has asked. If I say that my child is transgender and people don't understand, I say that he was assigned female at birth and he is now my trans son. So these are ways of communicating with people. One of the things that so when I was going through that season of grieving, I went through the bargaining phase with my son in the first few conversations we had about him being transgender. And I bargained with him and I said, can you just be lesbian? Like lesbians can dress masculine and then we don't have to deal with the bathroom issue, because there had been a big issue in the United States around bathrooms at that time. And I realized later on, looking back at that conversation, that with my other children who identify as bisexual and gay, I don't have to tell everybody that knew my son before he came out as gay that he is gay. Like if I go to a dentist appointment, he gets his teeth cleaned and I leave. Whereas if when I went to the dentist appointment with my son 6 months after he came out as transgender, I had to explain why I was bringing somebody who used a different name and dressed differently than when they saw him for their previous cleaning 6 months earlier. So you're constantly coming out. with a trans kid. And it is a bit more labor for the parent than if you have a child who identifies as pansexual. Uh, so that was something I just want to highlight in terms of communication. You do have to tell friends who knew your child, family who knew your child, anyone who knew your child. If you're calling them by a different name and suddenly, little Johnny shows up in a skirt, people ask questions. So yeah, that's. I'll add if anything else comes up.
I think you covered it. Yeah, you covered it really well. All I was going to add from from my perspective, from transverse perspective, is the idea of this concept of kind of sharing the load with, like Tammy said it well, is I think anybody going through this, and I'm guessing it's not much different for youth or young adults or adults, is that you enter once you go through transition, you enter this stage or this phase of chronic coming out. And I can tell you that it is absolutely exhausting. So if you're exhausted helping your child with this, chances are they are too, with respect to having this conversation. So I think that, how do you communicate? You support them and walk beside them through it, and make sure they don't have to do it alone, which is relatively intuitive for most parents, I guess. Um, yeah, I think that's it. We'll move on to our last question. I want to make sure we got time for our audience questions after. So the last one is really you're on the bus, and now the bus is moving. How do you've told the people you need to, you've told the people that they have wanted you to tell. Now you're stepping into this kind of unknown or undefined future. How do you support the trans child? And as I'm saying this, I want to, and Tammy can add to this as too, is how do you support yourself is maybe the other piece of this that we didn't have built into this question. But I mean, it's supporting the child, but it's also validating and recognizing that you are in your own process as a caregiver. And how do you support yourself?
So I think the answer really is a culmination of everything that we've said so far is affirm, affirm, affirm. Let them drive the bus. Um, and as a community, have as much representation in the community as possible. So if you are not the parent of a trans child, but an aunt or somebody who works with them, an educator, a pastor at a church, anyone who uses their pronouns, either when they introduce themselves or in their name tag or email signatures, these are all signals to the child that you're somewhat of a safe person. It doesn't mean they're automatically going to trust you, because trust is earned, but it gives them that little glimmer of hope that you get that, we're not all just, men and women from the time we were born and the body parts that were announced when we were born. So all of those supporting factors are very helpful as a community. And as a parent, for support, my best advice is to talk to other parents of trans kids. Parenting with Pride is an option. I know GLAD is an option. In Calgary, they have Gender Creative, which is a support group that I went to before Parenting with Pride began. So that getting support for yourself as a parent is great. If you have a very affirming friend that you can talk to, and there is, I had to go to therapy. We actually went to therapy as a couple, my husband and I. Our marriage was solid, but we didn't want. We were grieving and coming to acceptance and affirmation at different stages and at different levels. So we wanted to make sure that we were doing the right thing for the whole family as well as our son. So yeah, all of that.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add to that, I think Tammy summarized it really well. I mean, it's doing all those tactical things to support and affirm your child's identity. The other piece that we talk about a lot in the training we do is if you're concerned about the world that your child might be walking into, or as they grow up, is is be an active ally, get in the community and do things. So we talk a lot in the training about um, about just removing such a binary world that we live in. So you can do that with respect to forms or the example I use in training is going to buy classes and doing their intake. And one of the questions on the intake was what my sex was. And it's like those are the times that we as community members can kind of challenge that business and say, not in a negative way, just kind of have the conversation. It's like, why do you need to know what my sex is to sell me a pair of glasses? And the reality is, if all of us are kind of in the community doing that, um, that's one conversation you're saving your child, or one conversation you are saving somebody in the community from having. And my family, my spouse and myself, and even my daughter now is doing it all the time. To kind of challenging those, respectfully challenging those kind of norms. Honestly, 9 times out of 10, businesses or individuals will be like, yeah, you're right. We don't need to collect the information. So we have the opportunity and the potential as parents, as caregivers in the community, just to kind of start altering the world that they're going to grow up in. And I think if we all do that collectively, then really quickly the world starts to look a heck of a lot more inclusive for this population. So with that, I'm going to go to our question slide, and I'm going to get out of sharing screen mode so that I can actually see the questions. I have to open the questions.
Kirsten, have you seen any questions on your end? I've got a few on my end here.
Yeah, if you've got one to get us started, well,
I sure do.
go for it. Yeah.
How is this different than being gay?
You want me to take that one?
Sure, you go first.
So transgender is different than being gay because transgender is how you identify in your mind, and being gay is who you're attracted to. Someone who is gay, a man who is gay would be attracted to another man, either sexually or romantically. And again, that's a bit of a spectrum. But someone who is transgender doesn't necessarily mean that they are attracted to men or women, or that they have sexual attraction to anyone at all. It just means that they identify as the gender that they identify as, or no gender at all.
I think,
Thank you for that. Oh,
yeah, I would add just I'll use an example, not or sorry, a personal example. So we talk about it a lot in training, is for those that aren't aware, didn't see it when Airdrie last year had all of the vandalism in the city during Pride Month, kind of a year ago today. It was a conversation that Candace, one of the Pride board members, and I had around this was the reality for somebody trans or gender diverse is that it's so much harder to disappear if you feel you need to. Is for me, when all of that was happening, was incredibly challenging, and it was fear, and I felt scared, and there was no way that I could, quote unquote, disappear or blend in, because I am out, I am visibly trans. My voice, there's all these things that kind of quote unquote, out me, or whatever you want to think about it. So it's just a little bit different, I think. I would never say it's worse or harder or easier. I think it's just a little bit of a different dynamic.
I have another question here. Did my child rearing practices have any influence on my child's new identity?
Ah, I love this. The why question. Did I do this? Yeah, it was a question I asked myself a whole lot. In that grieving phase, I did a lot of research. I wondered if it was because of the amount of plastic that I had in my house. We give ourselves all of these superpowers, thinking that as parents we control everything, and that we cause things, and that we can relieve things. But there are things that are not in our control. So I do not believe that how we raise our children has any bearing on our child's gender identity. So all four of my kids, now I have a fifth kid, all four of my kids around the ages of 3 or 4 would see the difference between what is male and what is female in their environment, and they would assign masculine and feminine to different things. And so that is where they picked up the identity of, do I align with being told that I am a girl and mommy's a girl and Aunt Sally's a girl and I align with that? Or am I not aligning with it and then questioning what's really going on here? And then, so that is why a child can see when they're starting to see the difference between genders, if they align with them or not. And I don't think it matters if you've offered your kid a doll or a truck. I don't think that's going to change their identity. But Kiersten, I'd love to hear what you say.
I think, I mean, all I would add is Tammy knows me well enough to know that the way that I answered this question was I went back to school for 7 years. You know, I had all the same questions when I share my personal story. I talk about the years that I spent absolutely obsessed with trying to find, reading websites and medical journals and trying to find the thing that was quote unquote wrong with me, because I believed that if I could figure out the thing that was wrong with me, there would be a pill, there would be something they could do. They could take out a piece of my brain and then I would be quote unquote normal. The reality is where that could have saved a lot of time, but all of those years of research and exploration and trying to understand identity and gender identity ultimately taught me that there is, and we certainly don't got time to go into tonight, but there's a million different biological reasons that somebody's identity is different than their sex, right? There's a whole bunch of prenatal factors with respect to hormones. Your brain is sexed at a different time than your body is sexed. Your gender identity forms at 15 weeks prenatal versus your biology forms at at the beginning. So there's, like I said, there's a whole talk on that we could do. I would just reinforce what Tammy is it is nothing that you did as parents. I think that the difference now is that the world is a place where people can stand up and be authentic with respect to who they are. That's why it's becoming more common, because there is more space for it. It's not that trans kids didn't exist when I was in high school. It was that there was a zero space for trans kids to exist.
All right. Can you see some of the questions that have come in?
I see one.
Oh, I've got several.
Why do we need to identify as anything? I am me. You can either take me as I am or not at all. Why do we need to care what others think of us? Go ahead.
So I love the question, because I would like, yeah, I agree. The unfortunate piece is that our world is set up in a very, very binary way. And so, I mean, the question you're asking, Trina, I agree totally with you. But we need to get there. The world needs to get there. As a trans person in Alberta, it is incredibly difficult to access a family doctor. It's incredibly difficult to access essential services. So there is this this process with respect to identity, and owning this identity needs to happen to create space for it to be there. If there's, if equity and equality and all of those things are actually in place, then I agree with you. But the reality is we're just not there yet, is what I would say.
I think it also goes back to that first slide when we talked about categorization. As a species, humans feel safe by categorizing. And that is why identities still exist, and because our brains are set up that way. And it would be wonderful for none of us to be part of the out group and all of us to be part of the in group, but we're not there yet.
Tammy and Kirsten, can you speak to the events Airdrie Pride runs and also your parent session?
Sure. Yeah, we so every I mean, COVID has impacted our programming a little bit with respect to our community coffee and some of the other things we do, but we have through all of this been consistent with both our youth group, which is called Prism. So the youth named that when we started it 3 or 4 years ago, whatever, a few years ago.
Sorry,
So
I was reading the question.
so
Yeah, it's almost 4 years ago.
yeah, Prism they called Prism, so with Prism with a Y, and it stands for um what does it stand for? Pride Youth Social Movement, right?
That's right.
Okay. And then at that time as well, we started Parenting with Pride. So each of those events, we're doing them online or virtually right now, but each of those events happens for sure every month. So we run it at least once a month. And then, in a post-COVID time, we have our Pride Festival and Solidarity Walk, and then we also do a monthly, just kind of informal coffee for people to meet us and get a bit of comfort with the Pride team. And then we also do a Pride in the Pub thing, which is a social thing for kind of the 18 plus crowd.
So the question I see here is, I'm wondering about safety in online dating for my young adult daughter and any advice and support in navigating that whole area. I'm not there yet. We're not doing dating yet, thank goodness.
I think one thing we've done with the Prism Youth, we've partnered with Center for Sexuality in Calgary, and we've done kind of healthy relationship sessions. So I think it's, I can't, my kids aren't there yet either, in any case, but I think that our idea with Prism is to try and empower youth with the understanding and the knowledge that they need, that maybe they're not getting in public school with respect to being to us LGBTQ plus youth, with respect to healthy relationships, is that it could look a little bit different with same sex or diverse relationships. But yeah, I don't know that I would say too much more on that, other than teaching them how to engage in healthy relationships is, I think, what we can do as parents.
Yeah. Oop. Lost the chart.
Just pop that poll up there, but we have lots of questions.
Okay, let me see here. I know everyone has a different timeline for themselves, but I'm wondering how long it took for you to get to the surrender time where you let them finally be the driver. To be completely honest, my surrender moment happened when I received a phone call from the school saying that my son had attempted suicide. And nothing woke me up faster than that cold bucket of water to the face. And that's when I surrendered. It had been about 6 months since he had come out. So we were doing the affirming. We'd changed his name. He had done all of the social transition, and we were on a waiting list to go to the meta clinic. But I did not realize how painful it was for him to have to go through this transition until that time. We knew that he had been depressed. I just didn't know how much. And God knows I did not want to have my son be one of those statistics. So that was my black and white surrender time. I wish it was more romantic, but it's not. And then my niece gave birth to a few months ago, and her child was AMAB. I love that, assigned male at birth, for those who don't know all the acronyms. Do you have any suggestions for how to make space for my grand nibbling until he can understand and vocalize his gender. Family is currently using he, him pronouns, but we are already talking about how we won't know until my grand nibbling knows. I think that's perfect. Just honoring the fact that honoring the fact that gender will never show up until they're about between 3 and 8 years old, and that everything that we are doing with our children before that age is gender that we are assigning to them.
Yeah, I think the way that I would answer that question is, I think that it's such a beautiful question, because it kind of it illustrates kind of the challenge in our society. There's gender reveal parties. There's so much pressure from the very beginning to be something that the world thinks you should be. I think when I think about it, it's really, as a parent, a caregiver, a grandparent, whoever, it's really just being cautious around gendering all of the things that we don't need to gender, toys and clothes and all those sorts of things. With my spouse and I, along the way, I mean, we, even before I was going through transition, kind of consciously or subconsciously knowing where it was going to end up, we corrected a lot of those conversations. Well, that's, girls can only do this and boys can only do that. And and we would always respond with, names or activities or clothes or whatever don't have gender. You can do whatever you want and whatever feels right for you. I think it's part of it. The more personal thing I share is, I mean, the incredible, and it's really simple, but it would have made all the difference, is the value that just hearing a positive conversation would have had on my own journey and my own kind of self-acceptance with all of this. So I think that we all have that ability to turn this into a really positive conversation. And I don't mean sitting your child down and saying, gender identity is okay in our family. I mean just adding it to the dialogue, to the media that you're watching, to the conversation. One thing we did to get our children kind of ready for it was, we didn't have a single conversation with them. We actually bought 5 or 6 kids books that were kind of focused on gender diversity or transgender issues, and we bought them. They came in the mail, and we just put them in their bookshelf, and we just let it happen very organically. And so that when I came out, or when we talked to them about me, it made total sense to them. They were like, "Oh, that's like this boy in this book that I love." So I think it's complicated as big as all this seems. Sometimes it's adding all those little things into a kid's life that affirms for them that there is space for them to step into if they need to.
Next question is for you, Kirsten. The more I try to define male, female, the less clear it becomes. There is such a spectrum at all levels in both identities. Kirsten, you define it as who you feel you are when you wake up. I keep wanting my trans daughter to be able to define why it is she feels female. Can trans people usually identify what it is in their own personality that defines them as male or female?
I mean, it's the way that I always answer that is is turning around and asking the question to yourself, is can you, I think it applies with anybody. If somebody says, like, how do you know you're gay? It's like, well, how did you know you were straight? How do you know you like wearing pink? Or how did you know that you like wearing green? It's why I'm careful to use that innate thing. And so I can't give you a clear answer. What I can share with you is kind of some of the unexpected things for me, and I've shared this with Tammy before, is I went through my own gender transition. I did the surgeries, I did all of that, the process. I walked down the path until I got to a point where I was comfortable. When I think about the things that that were most impactful, I mean, I certainly needed to do all of it to get to where I am, and to get to the comfort in myself that I am. But I remember I'll use one example just for the sake of time, but one of the most impactful things for me was after I had started HRT, so started hormone replacement therapy. And I will never forget the morning, probably 3 or 4 months after I started, the morning when I rolled over in bed and my head hit the pillow in a different way, and I smelled different. I smelled like I didn't smell like I had always smelled, if that makes sense. My pillow smelled differently. And it was this incredible moment of joy of just, okay, that's it. That's what was missing. You know, it was this little thing. When my family and I go camping, it's the little stuff for me. It's putting on a baseball cap with a ponytail. I never had long hair when I was a kid. I mean, long hair feels the way it feels in my back and hits my shoulders in the shower is what I expected it to feel like, and that was what was missing. So it's really hard to define. I think it's for everybody it's different, and I think it's a little bit of it's a whole bunch of little things that kind of compound or add together to make you just feel comfortable in your own skin. I always used to joke, people would ask me when I decided to go through transition, they said, "What are you looking most forward to?" And I said, going to the grocery store on Sunday and getting groceries, like just as me. Like I didn't, there was nothing grand about what I wanted to do with my life. It was really just the little things that I was missing.
This question is, do you think the parents should fund $ the process? And honestly, there's nothing to fund besides buying my son boy clothes instead of girl clothes and changing his girl skates to boy skates. And all of that can be done secondhand at secondhand stores if you don't have to do, brand names and expensive gear in terms of the financial cost. Luckily, once we were on hormone blockers and cross hormones, my husband's work supplemental health care paid for those medications. And surgeries are paid for by our healthcare system. So there really isn't anything to pay for. I do have to pay for syringes and alcohol swabs and that kind of thing. But the way I look at it, if my son was diabetic, I'd have paid for all of that stuff anyways. So I'm perfectly okay with funding syringes. Then my 16-year-old non-binary teen is suicidal. They desperately need top surgery for both physical and emotional pain. How can we get AHS to expedite the process? I have been told no referral until age 18 and then 2 to 3 year wait list. I'm in the same boat except for the suicidal part, and I'm sorry, that is quite a struggle, and I do hope that you're both getting support for that. The only thing that we have right now is to send letters to all of our MLAs that we're kind of, that's all we got.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would say that's it. I think it's putting pressure on the system. I think these last couple of questions that Tammy addressed, it's getting it's elevating it to the same level as, we don't second guess if somebody, needs knee surgery or somebody needs, this is life-saving for individuals. And I mean, for myself personally, I cannot even put into words, the gift it was just to get to that place in my life. It is truly my version of impossible. To wake up every morning and smile and just be okay with the person I am in my own skin. So you've got folks like us, certainly, and many other organizations that are advocating and fighting for, for the process and for funding. But to echo what Tammy said, certainly if you need support, reach out to our programs, or if your youth needs support, reach out. I think that there's so many uncontrollables in this journey for many people with respect to accessing care and timing and all those sorts of things. I always think the one thing that we should be able to control is making sure nobody has to do it alone, and making sure there's resources and support for folks. Tammy talked earlier about the suicide and affirming trans youth. And she said the you know, once affirmed, it brings the statistic way down. The thing I wanted to add that I forgot was it only takes one person to affirm that. Like that stat is built on just one person affirming that person's identity, is all it takes to bring that stat down. So whether it's a parent, a teacher, an aunt, an uncle, a grandpa or grandma, um, it's something that is in our control to support you through this.
And then the next question, which I have experience with, and you're definitely getting a lot of experience with lately, is with the school, can we ask them to change a child's gender to match their identity, or does that require a legal process? So for my child, his preferred name and gender were changed front facing, but his school records could not be changed until we had a legal name change. So the problem with that is that if he were to have a substitute teacher and they were doing roll call, his birth name would have been on the roll call. There are some systems that are changing that so that the preferred name is on the roll call. But I know Kirsten's been working with Rocky View School, so what's new?
Yeah, I would, yeah, just echo what Tammy's saying. I mean, I would say the system needs to change. So one of the places that Airdrie Pride's been working hard to get into, and we've been really successful in the last kind of 3 or 4 months, is where we are now actively involved with Rocky View Schools. I think we've trained or done training with about 300 administrators, 270 or something at this point. And these are the conversations we're having, because the reality is that there's no good excuse to not. There's certainly situations, your doctor's office, in different places where you need to have certain information of a certain detail to care for that child. I will argue till I'm blue in the face, Tammy, with the same. There's so much of that information you don't need to teach a kid grade 6 math. And if what we're trying to do with the training is just reframe this a little bit, because if you look at it through a psychology lens, each time we misgender, each time that child or that youth is dead named, each time, all of those are microaggressions and essentially a form of trauma. And when you compound all of those together, that's what's leading to the challenging environment that and the statistics that we see. So from our perspective, that is very controllable stuff. What I would say from a very positive perspective is, in our experience with Rocky View School so far, is they are very receptive. It's more they just weren't sure how to change things, but I'm actually really confident within kind of 6 months to a year we will be at a place where these sorts of things are fixed in Rockview, and then we'll move on. We're just starting.
Take over the world.
Yeah.
That's the last question that I can see.
It is. So I've mentioned that the handouts can be shared along with the recording that will be sent out in the coming days. If any of your questions weren't answered, please email either ces@ahs.ca or myself, wendy.eloit@ahs.ca, and I'll forward your questions on to Tammy and Kiersten or professionals within AHS who can help you. Thank you both for joining us this evening and helping so many people, myself included. And we hope you'll present for us again. Happy Pride.
I would
Thank you.
say, yeah,
Right.
I would add before we leave, if you've got questions, certainly feel free to come to the next Parenting with Pride. Just watch our Facebook page and come join us and chat with us. It's usually a really great conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.